Everyone in Brackenridge Bluffs said Ephraim Cole's old cliffside ranch was nothing but rotten beams and lost memories, a place better left to the storms. But when his aging canine, Briggs, began pulling him toward the fog-soaked ravine behind the ruins, Ephraim found something that made his heart stop. Standing half-buried in the cold clay was a dying rodeo horse no one had noticed or cared to save, its legs bound by rusted wire, its breath shallow, its eyes burning with a desperate will to live. In that gaze, Ephraim saw the same broken courage he'd carried home from war, the part of himself he'd buried for decades. What happened next became a choice that would either redeem them both or drown them in the coming storm. Please support us by subscribing to follow the rest of this journey. A thin curtain of sea fog drifted across the cliffs, carrying the cold breath of the Pacific into the lonely highlands. Ephraim Cole tightened his grip on the cracked steering wheel of his rust-stained pickup as it climbed the serpentine road toward Brackenridge Bluffs. At 66, his hands bore the story of his life more clearly than any diary could. Scar tissue knotted from their airborne jumps, veins raised like faded blue ropes, knuckles enlarged by old breaks never set right. His face, long and angular, was weathered into permanent creases that no warmth could fully smooth. Wisps of silver hair curled from beneath his frayed canvas cap, and his once square shoulders now slouched forward, as if every regret he carried added a pound of invisible weight. He drove slowly, not because he lacked strength, but because each bend of this road tested a memory he wasn't sure he could face. Beside him, curled like a stone statue in the passenger seat, lay Briggs, a 12-year-old German shepherd with a wolf-gray coat dusted by age. His ears, once sharp as antennae on deployment, now tilted at a gentler angle, but his amber eyes still held the quiet vigilance of a former military canine. His left hind leg dragged slightly from an old tendon injury earned during a riot containment drill years ago, yet the dog's posture radiated a sort of solemn dignity, the dignity of someone who understands pain and follows his human anyway. Ephraim exhaled slowly, tasting salt on his tongue, not from seawater but from nerves. 30 years. 30 years of wandering from one seasonal job to another, one cheap motel bed to the next, hiding in the noise of unfamiliar towns so he wouldn't hear the echo of what he'd abandoned. The Cole homestead, once perched proudly on a ridge above the roaring Pacific, had collapsed after a landslide and fire. His parents had died in that chaos. He had been thousands of miles away under the rigid order of military life, telling himself that duty first was a noble enough excuse. It wasn't. Not when the letters stopped coming, not when the phone call finally reached him. He had never forgiven himself for not turning around in time. The bluffs appeared through the fog like a partially remembered dream, worn gray, nearly silent. The town of West Brackenridge slouched along the edge of the coastal road. Weather-beaten shacks, salt-bitten fences, sagging porches. At the corner sat Peg and Millie's General Goods, a squat wooden store with a perpetually flickering sign. Ephraim pulled into the gravel out front, the pickup coughing to a stop. Inside, the store smelled of dried kelp, old rope, and cedar polish. Behind the counter stood Silas Kincaid, the man Ephraim had hoped to avoid. Silas was in his early 50s, tall with a raw-boned frame and a jawline sharp enough to cut rope. His dark blonde hair, though neatly combed, had a permanent stiffness that matched his personality. A well-trimmed mustache shadowed his thin upper lip, giving him the air of a man who always thought he knew better than everyone else. His eyes, cold, pale blue, spoke of calculation, not kindness. Once a local rancher's son, Silas had reinvented himself as the owner of Kincaid Wind and Range, buying up land on the ridges to build wind turbines. He was known for smiling at people while outbidding them for their family homes. Years of winning every negotiation had curved his personality into something sharp and predatory. "Well, I'll be damned," Silas said, As Ephraim stepped inside, his voice smooth yet dripping with false surprise. "If it isn't Ephraim Cole, folks said you'd never come back." His gaze slid over Ephraim like someone appraising scrap metal. "You're looking bent. Back still bad? Shame, shame." Ephraim ignored the jab. "Just need gas." Silas leaned both elbows on the counter, smiling with the satisfaction of a cat cornering a limping mouse. "Heard you're heading up to the old Cole place. Waste of a drive. That land's more rot than soil now, but I'm generous. Tell you what, I'll take it off your hands. Cheap. Save you the trouble." Ephraim's jaw clenched. Behind him, Briggs stood silently at the doorway, posture stiff, staring at Silas with an instinctive dislike only dogs and children are brave enough to show. "No sale," Ephraim said quietly. There was no tremor in his voice, though something fragile cracked deep inside him, pride perhaps, or the last thread holding back decades of guilt. Silas scoffed. "Suit yourself, old man, just don't freeze to death on that cliff." Ephraim left without replying. As he exited, he felt the heavy weight of the town's eyes on him, curious, doubtful, almost pitying. He understood. To them, he was a ghost wandering back to the ruins of his own life. The road to the ridge was choked with weeds and slick with sea mist. When he finally reached the Cole property, his breath caught. What had once been a 2-story cedar house now lay in a heap of broken boards and smoke-stained beams. The barn, half collapsed, leaned at a crooked angle like a dying animal. Wild grass reached up to the windows of the ruined house, as though trying to swallow what remained of the past. Ephraim cut the engine. Silence engulfed him. Only the distant crash of waves far below reminded him that time hadn't stopped. Briggs hopped down first, sniffing the salty wind, his ears flicking in subtle worry. Ephraim stood beside the truck, the cold drizzle settling into his jacket. For a moment his knees threatened to give. This was not home. It was the graveyard of everything he'd failed to protect. That night, with the fog thickening and the rain tapping nervously on the windshield, Ephraim and Briggs curled into the cab of the old pickup. The heater was dead. The air smelled of wet dog and rust. Ephraim stared through the fogged glass at the silhouette of the ruined house, and an ache deeper than age settled into his bones. It felt like a final stop, one last quiet surrender on a cliff where no one would notice. And yet somewhere beneath that crushing weight, a faint spark stirred. He didn't know it yet, but this broken place had one last mission waiting for him. Morning arrived without sunlight. The sky hung low in a sheet of pewter gray, and the sea fog, thicker than the night before, rolled over the cliffs like slow-moving ghosts. The air carried a clammy chill common to the Pacific coast in late autumn, not bitterly cold but heavy, wet, and insistent. Moisture clung to Ephraim Cole's eyelashes as he blinked awake in the cab of the pickup, feeling every joint in his spine protest the contorted sleep he had forced on his 66-year-old body. Briggs was already awake. The old German shepherd sat upright in the passenger seat, his gray-tipped ears pointed sharply toward the ruins of the homestead. He whined, a thin, focused sound, and scraped one paw against the door. It wasn't a request to relieve himself. It was something more urgent. "What is it, pal?" Ephraim muttered, rubbing the heel of his hand over his tired eyes. Briggs let out a second whine, sharper this time, and shot a glance at his master that carried unmistakable insistence. Ephraim opened the door, immediately greeted by a gust of wet sea wind that slapped his face. Briggs jumped down, landing stiffly on his old hind leg, then trotted ahead with surprising purpose. Ephraim followed, knees cracking, breath fogging in the morning damp. They passed the collapsed porch, splinters jutting upward like ribs of a long dead animal, and stepped across patches of crumbling brick, half sunk into the soil. Briggs led him around the remnants of the barn, its timbers darkened by decades of moisture, then toward a narrow footpath that descended behind the property. Ephraim recognized it at once, though he hadn't walked it in more than 30 years. As a boy, this moss-covered trail had been his secret escape, a serpentine dirt ribbon that wound down into the ravine where ferns grew tall, and the stream once whispered over smooth river stones. Now the trail was slick with algae, each step threatening to pitch him sideways into the brush. "Easy," he murmured to himself more than to the dog. Briggs didn't slow. The shepherd moved downhill with the confidence of someone who had survived worse terrain, his tail stiff, nose pulled forward by a scent Ephraim couldn't yet detect. When the trail leveled out, Ephraim saw how the landscape had changed. A landslide, probably from a storm years earlier, had sheared away half the slope. Mud, rock fragments, and twisted root systems filled the ravine floor. The old streambed was gone, buried beneath a wash of silt. Only silence remained. And then, a sound. A strained, shuddering grunt. Briggs stopped so abruptly that Ephraim almost stumbled into him. The dog lowered his body, head tilted slightly, ears pricked forward. Something was alive down here. Ephraim stepped around a fallen cedar trunk, pushing aside wet foliage. And there, at the lowest angle of the ravine where the landslide had gouged a bowl into the earth, he saw it. A horse, or what was left of one. The animal was a mottled coat of dust-stained chestnut and white, likely a rodeo-bred quarter-horse mix, once powerful, now emaciated to the point of transparency. Its ribs stood out like barrel staves beneath its skin, its hips angular and skeletal. Its mane hung in clumps, tangled with dried mud. The horse's front legs were sunk deep in the hardened basin of old clay, and around both forelegs, embedded into the flesh, were strands of rusted barbed wire, multiple coils, tight enough that every shallow movement sent a thin rivulet of blood sliding down the fetlocks. The wire wasn't loose debris. Someone had discarded it here, carelessly, thoughtlessly. The horse must have stumbled into it when the mud was wetter, trapping itself until the clay dried like cement. It raised its head when Ephraim approached, revealing dark, wide eyes filled with terror and exhaustion. Eyes Ephraim had seen before on young soldiers pinned down in foreign lands, refusing to surrender even as the world closed in around them. "Oh, hell," Ephraim whispered, voice thick. Briggs took a step forward, but Ephraim held out a shaky hand. "Easy, boy. We don't know how bad he's hurt." The horse snorted sharply, a desperate defensive sound, though it couldn't move more than a few inches. The barbed wire bit deeper with the effort, and Comet, Ephraim didn't yet know that would be the name, let out a low groan that echoed in the ravine. Ephraim crouched, ignoring the flare of pain in his knees. He examined the wire, 4 loops nearly fused with swollen flesh. The wounds swollen, warm, and glistening with infection. Weeks, maybe months. No one had checked this ravine in a long time, and no one in West Brackenridge would care. No one, except Silas Kincaid. And Silas would see an animal like this as nothing more than biological waste. Ephraim knew the type of man Silas was. Pragmatic, cruel in the subtle ways. A creature that could not be turned into profit had no place in his world. Briggs looked at Ephraim, eyes steady, intelligent. The old shepherd shifted forward, lowering his head in a calming posture, tail still, stance firm, the same stance he once used in military therapy sessions to soothe veterans gripped by panic. Briggs was saying something without words. "This is why you're here. This is the mission." Ephraim swallowed hard. His heart hammered painfully in his chest, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to purpose, something he hadn't felt in years. He stepped closer. The horse tensed but did not thrash. It no longer had the strength. Its breathing came in short, rapid bursts. Ephraim spoke softly, the tone he once used to calm young recruits half his age. "Easy, son. I'm not here to hurt you." His voice wavered. The horse blinked slowly, ears flicking, as if weighing whether to trust the trembling human in front of him. Ephraim reached down toward the wire but stopped when the horse flinched. "We'll get you out. Just hang on." A gust of fog swept over the ravine, dampening his jacket and turning the barbs into gleaming points of rust. Ephraim exhaled through his teeth. There was no universe in which Silas Kincaid could learn about this animal, and there was no universe in which Ephraim Cole would walk away. He looked at Briggs. The dog held his gaze, unwavering. "All right," Ephraim whispered, a vow more than a statement. "We start here." And with that promise, heavy, impossible yet entirely necessary, the broken soldier, the battered dog, and the dying horse began the unlikely story that would change everything. The fog had barely lifted when Ephraim Cole began the long ascent back toward the ruins of the house, Briggs trotting at his side and Comet, still trapped in the ravine, watching him leave with a trembling, confused gaze. Every step Ephraim took felt wrong, as if gravity itself were trying to drag him back to the broken horse he could not yet save. But he needed tools, rope, water, something, anything, to give the animal a chance. When he reached the shattered footprint of the old Cole house, the wind picked up, sweeping across the ridge with the sour tang of sea brine. Ephraim paused at what remained of the front room, foundation stone, stones swallowed by moss, and scanned the debris field. He was searching for a crowbar he remembered from childhood, a tool his father always kept beneath the floorboards. But as he moved aside a fallen beam, he noticed something else, a small depression in the earth, unnaturally smooth, its edges choked by weeds and tufts of coastal grass. "Briggs," he murmured. The dog sniffed at the patch of ground, tail flicking uncertainly. Ephraim pushed aside more debris, clearing a rectangular outline of metal. Rust coated the edges, turning the iron door a deep, sickly red. A set of hinges, thick, old-fashioned, clung stubbornly to the frame. He recognized it instantly, the storm shelter. His father had built it during the late 70s after a winter cyclone swallowed 3 boats off the coast. Ephraim had only been a kid then, but he remembered the pride on his father's face when he showed it off. Concrete ribs and steel bones. This house can fall, but this shelter won't. Ephraim pulled the iron ring set into the hatch and lifted. It barely budged. Briggs whined. Ephraim adjusted his footing, dug in, and pulled harder. Something cracked beneath the strain, then the door yawned open with a scream of rusted hinges. A breath of stale, mineral-scented air wafted up. A trapped memory exhaled after decades underground. He reached inside for the light switch he faintly remembered, but his fingers met only cold concrete. Briggs descended first, his paws tapping on the old metal steps. Ephraim followed, leading with a flashlight from his coat pocket. The beam cut through darkness, revealing the shelter's bow-shaped ceiling. Poured concrete, still strong despite its age. The walls were lined with shelves of canned food, long since ruptured, their labels melted into pulp. But on the far table sat a sealed, rectangular tin box, green enamel with a brass latch, edges uncorroded, as if someone had placed it there only yesterday. Ephraim's pulse quickened. He approached, set his flashlight down, and brushed away dust. The tin was military-grade, airtight. His father's handwriting was scrawled faintly on a strip of tape across the top. "For Ephraim, if he comes home." His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were several cassette tapes, each marked with dates from the final months before the landslide. Beneath them lay a stack of letters, pages yellowed, handwriting shaky, corners softened by time. He lifted the first tape. His father's voice, in memory, had always been strong, barrel-thick, never wavering. Yet the handwriting on the cassette label was uneven, skipping slightly, as though written by hands that no longer trusted themselves to stay steady. He placed the tape in the portable cassette player beside the box, a relic that somehow still worked after years in the dry bunker, and pressed play. A soft, static hiss filled the shelter, followed by a breathy silence. Then his father's voice, weak, strained, a tone he had never heard in life. "Ephraim, We didn't want to burden you. Your mother said you're doing God's work out there, said we should be proud, and we are. Son, we are. But the storms have gotten worse. The bank keeps calling, said they'll take the land if we can't pay. But I know you'll come home someday. I know you'll protect this place." Ephraim's throat tightened. He pressed his palm against his eyes, but the tears leaked through anyway, cutting warm tracks down the cold dirt on his cheeks. The second tape was worse. His mother's voice, usually gentle, warm, trembled like wind through broken shutters. "They say another storm is coming tonight. The ground is shaking. There are cracks forming near the barn. But your father still believes you'll return. He says the land remembers you, that you'll rebuild it better than we ever could." He stopped the tape, unable to bear more. His breath came ragged. He had stayed on base during that winter. He remembered the argument with his commanding officer. "I can't leave them," he'd said. But he had, because what waited in the barracks, noise, command, distraction, was easier than the truth waiting back home. He dropped heavily onto a rusting metal stool. Briggs pressed his head into Ephraim's thigh, sensing the shift in his breathing, the tremor in his hand. "You tried to tell me," Ephraim whispered to the tapes, to ghosts, to the version of himself that had run from the weight of expectation. "I just didn't listen." He stayed like that for several minutes, letting the pain settle, letting memory gnaw at the edges of his resolve. Finally, he straightened his back, slowly, as if lifting the full weight of the past. On the shelf above the tin box sat an old weather radio. He switched it on, hoping the batteries hadn't corroded beyond use. After a burst of static, a crisp announcer's voice crackled through. "A significant atmospheric river is expected to hit the Pacific Northwest within 72 hours. Residents near coastal hillsides should prepare for high winds, prolonged rainfall, and elevated risk of landslides and flooding." Ephraim looked sharply at Briggs. The ravine, Comet. 3 days of non-stop rain would turn that basin into a churning throat of mud. The horse wouldn't last an hour once the water started pouring through. Ephraim pushed himself to his feet and began searching the shelter. Wooden planks, lengths of old rope, a rusted pulley system, tarps hardened by time, metal hooks. He gathered everything that wasn't rotted through and hauled it up the ladder, dropping each armful onto the ground above. He worked without pause, driven not by panic, but by something deeper, an instinct that had lain dormant for years. The instinct of a rescuer, a man who once crawled into collapsed buildings for strangers, a man who could not walk away from anything still clinging to life. When the last load was taken outside, the sky above the ridge had darkened further, the fog drifting inland like a slow-moving tide. Ephraim pulled the shelter door shut, leaving behind the whispers of the past, and turned toward the path leading back to the ravine. "We don't have long," he said to Briggs. The shepherd barked once, short, certain. Ephraim squared his shoulders. They would reinforce the shelter. They would haul Comet free. They would be ready before the atmospheric river hit. This time he would not run from the ones depending on him. He would not abandon anything again. By late afternoon, the sky had curdled into a bruised sheet of charcoal, the kind of oppressive gray that swallows the horizon whole. The wind no longer drifted in with its usual coastal laziness. It slashed across the ridge in sharp, uneven bursts, carrying with it a biting sea damp that slipped beneath Ephraim Cole's coat and lodged deep in his bones. The first drops of rain came sideways, cold needles stinging his cheeks, before surrendering to the full weight of the coming storm. There would be no turning back now. The atmospheric river was arriving early. Ephraim centered himself beside the ravine where Comet waited, trapped but no longer entirely hopeless. The horse shivered intermittently, not just from pain but from the knowledge, instinctual, ancient, that storms could swallow valleys whole. His chestnut and white coat, slicked now by rain, clung tightly to his ribs. The infection in his front legs throbbed visibly beneath the flesh, but there was a different look in his eyes tonight. Less panic, more grim endurance, as if the knowledge that hands were finally helping him had given him back a sliver of courage. Briggs remained close, the old shepherd's coat darkened to near black by the rain. His breathing remained steady, controlled, a calculated rhythm designed to calm other creatures, something drilled into him during years of trauma therapy sessions he once performed at military hospitals. Briggs positioned himself so that Comet could hear him at all times, chest rising and falling slow and sure, a metronome of survival. Ephraim set to work immediately, driven more by instinct than planning. He had fashioned a makeshift pulley from an old engine spindle he'd found in the barn ruins, a length of rope salvaged from a coil half buried under debris, and 2 weathered planks repurposed from the barn door. It wasn't elegant engineering, it wasn't even safe by any reasonable standard, but it was what he had, and right now it was enough. He hammered the first plank into the softened ground of the ravine wall, cursing as the rain made the wood slip from his fingers. The rope soaked instantly, weighing heavier with each passing second. He looped the end around Comet's chest, knotting it beneath the horse's ribs. Comet trembled violently, feet scraping uselessly against the clay basin. Briggs emitted a low, controlled rumble of reassurance. "Easy, son," Ephraim murmured, voice hoarse. "We're getting you out. Just stay with me." The barbed wire was next. He knelt in the mud, water soaking his jeans until they clung to his skin like ice. The rusted coils were wedged so deep into the horse's flesh that mud and pus oozed out as soon as he touched them. He swallowed back the sting of bile. Infection, if not already systemic, would be soon. But there was no time for sterile technique. There was only time for removal. He gripped the pliers, cold, stiff, barely functional, and began to cut. Each snip sent a painful jolt through Comet's legs. The horse tried once to pull back, but his strength faltered instantly. Briggs stepped forward, pressing his shoulder gently into Comet's side, grounding him. Rain streamed down the shepherd's muzzle, pooling at the tip before dripping into the mud. Another cut, and another. The final loop snapped free, recoiling like a snake into the mud. Comet let out a guttural sound, something between pain and disbelief, as blood trickled in thin lines down his forelegs, mixing with the rainwater rushing beneath them. "There," Ephraim breathed, chest heaving. "You're free of that bastard." But they were far from safe. The wind howled like a living creature now, forcing tree branches to whip violently above them. The ravine began to fill, shallow streams snaking down from the ridge walls. The first true surge of stormwater sloshed into the basin, swirling around Ephraim's ankles. Time had run out. "Briggs, back!" Ephraim strained against the rope, pulling, shifting his weight upward, using the crude pulley to lift Comet inch by inch. The horse cried out, raw, agonized, but pushed with his hind legs. Mud gave way beneath them. The rain battered their backs, drumming harder and harder as if urging them to fail. 1 foot free. Then the second, with a massive lurch, Comet slid upward, collapsing onto the ravine slope. Ephraim nearly fell backward with the force of it, twisting his spine painfully as he steadied himself. He tied the rope to a boulder, knelt beside the horse, and checked him breathlessly. Comet was shaking violently but alive. The rain washed his wounds clean in real time, painful but necessary. "Up you go," Ephraim whispered, pushing against Comet's shoulder. "You're not dying down here." Somehow, impossibly, the horse obeyed. They made it to the ridge just as the storm broke open in full. Rain fell without mercy, thick, endless sheets that blurred the world into gray streaks. The wind whipped so fiercely that Comet's mane snapped sideways like a flag. Briggs stayed glued to Ephraim's heel, snarling into the gale as though challenging the storm itself. The 3 of them staggered toward the shelter. By the time they reached the entrance, water was already rolling down the slope in brown ribbons, threatening to engulf the trail altogether. Ephraim shoved the iron door open, muscles screaming, and ushered Comet inside. The horse hesitated only a moment, terror battling instinct, before ducking his head and stepping into the shelter's tight darkness. Briggs darted in next. Ephraim slammed the hatch shut. Darkness swallowed them. The storm crashed above like 1,000 drums, each raindrop amplified by the concrete ceiling. The air inside the shelter grew humid quickly, warmed by bodies and breath. Comet shifted nervously, hooves scraping the floor. A small cluster of wild chickens, startled when Ephraim had dragged them from the collapsing barn earlier, huddled in a corner, feathers puffed, eyes blinking in alarm. Ephraim sank onto a crate, his back seized. A bolt of pain shot up his spine so violently he nearly cried out. His vision blurred, his breath hitched. The fever hit fast, a burning surge of exhaustion. After hours of strain, cold wind and rain seeping into every pore, he leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees. But the world tilted dangerously, and then the hallucinations came. Thunder became mortar fire, rain became falling debris. The cramped shelter walls became the flooded alley in Fallujah where he had lost 3 men in minutes. He heard their voices, Grant, Morales, little Timmy, their names slamming against the inside of his skull with each heartbeat. Grant, get down, Timmy. His breath broke. I can't. God, I can't. He didn't know he was shouting until Briggs launched onto his chest. The old shepherd used his weight with surgical precision, front paws planted gently on Ephraim's sternum, head pressed beneath his chin. Briggs licked his jawline, then settled into deep, rhythmic breaths, inches from his face, in out. A steady, grounding cadence. Comet, sensing panic, lowered his head until his muzzle rested near Ephraim's shoulder, exhaling warm air that mingled with the shepherd's steady pulse. Ephraim's tremors softened, his breaths lengthened. The hallucinations faded. The storm still raged, but inside the shelter, a different kind of warmth filled the cramped space, radiating from living bodies pressed close in POW survival's fragile communion. And somewhere between breath and heartbeat, Ephraim understood. This was no longer just survival. This was redemption. 3 days after the storm, the sky finally cracked open to let a weak, amber-tinted sunlight spill across Brackenridge Bluffs. The ocean winds softened from violent howls to low, restless murmurs, and the coastline, though drenched, bruised, and littered by mud, was alive again. The townsfolk had already begun whispering over breakfast counters and hardware shop aisles that Ephraim Cole must have been swept off the ridge or frozen clean through. An old man, a crippled horse, and a senior K-9, no one expected survivors. Sheriff Marlowe Trent drove the climb toward the Cole property that morning, his SUV grinding over wet gravel. Marlowe was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, his beard streaked silver and trimmed short to hide the scar that ran down the right side of his chin, earned from shrapnel in Beirut long before he pinned a badge to his coat. He carried himself with the quiet discipline of someone who had once commanded young soldiers, and beneath his sternness lived a deep understanding of what war did to a man's conscience. Silas Kincaid followed in his spotless black pickup, its chrome shining smugly in the muted sun. He stepped out wearing a freshly pressed wax jacket and an expression of irritated superiority. Silas was in his late 40s, with hair slicked back too neatly for a place ruled by storms, and eyes that always assessed land as if it were already his. He had made his fortune buying failing ranches and converting them into energy farms. Turbines, solar grids, anything profitable. The Cole property, perched beautifully above the cliffs, was his white whale. The storm, in his mind, had solved his last obstacle. They approached the ridge expecting devastation. Instead, they met life. Comet stood in the clearing, slim but steady, legs wrapped neatly with strips of clean cloth. The wounds had begun to knit. Draped over his back was an old olive-green army field jacket, the fabric faded but unmistakably military. The horse's ears swiveled toward the intruders, and he stamped once, a warning that he was no longer the dying creature they had imagined. Briggs waited at the entrance of the storm shelter, a silent sentinel. The German shepherd's fur was darker from age and moisture, and a new line of stiffness crept through his hind legs, but nothing about his posture wavered. He locked eyes with Silas, and though he didn't snarl, a single low rumble rolled in his chest. A boundary drawn. The iron hatch swung open. Ephraim Cole stepped into the morning light. He was gaunt, face sharpened by exhaustion, but his eyes were startlingly clear, brighter than they had been in years. His clothes were weather-beaten, his knuckles scraped raw, but he stood with the spine of a paratrooper who had not forgotten how to face down a storm. Silas lifted his chin, ready to put on the faux concerned voice he used whenever he wanted something cheap. But Ephraim spoke first. "The land's not for sale," he said, voice low but firm. "Not now, not ever, and this horse stays with me. He's squad now." Silas blinked, the rehearsed words in his mouth turning bitter. He glanced toward Marlowe, expecting support. He found none. Marlowe stepped forward, his boots sinking into the wet soil. He surveyed the scene with a trained eye. Sandbags stacked along the shelter's exterior, patches of clay pressed into the cracks, a tarp stretched in a dual-layer seal, barrels of water, feed piles, the faint smell of cooked grain drifting from inside, and all of it built by one aging veteran in the middle of a storm that should have destroyed him. "Ephraim," Marlowe said quietly, "you've kept your people alive." Ephraim nodded once. "Those that needed keeping." Marlowe turned to Silas, his jaw tightening. "This man is competent, fit, and in full possession of his faculties," he declared. "His land stays his, and you will not harass him again. Any claim of abandonment or hazard is off the table." Silas opened his mouth to protest, but Marlowe's gaze, stern, unmoving, cut through him like winter wind. Silas swallowed hard, forced a smirk, and muttered through clenched teeth, "Fine, let him rot up here with his animals." Then he stomped back to his truck, boots splashing spitefully in the mud. Marlowe watched him go, then turned back to Ephraim. A rare softness touched his expression. "You did good, soldier," he said. "You held your ground." He adjusted the brim of his hat in a subtle salute before heading down the ridge. Ephraim stood a long moment, breathing the salt-tinged air, his hand resting on Comet's neck. Briggs pressed against his leg, silent as always. They had survived the storm, and something had shifted, inside him, inside this land. Months passed. Spring arrived like a shy visitor. The cliffs sprouted pale green veins of grass, and seabirds returned to their old perches. Comet, lean but reborn, galloped across the soft fields, his hooves beating the earth with reclaimed strength. Briggs followed at a slower pace, hips stiff but tail held proudly, as if inspecting the perimeter of a new kingdom. Ephraim rebuilt the house slowly, plank by plank, his hands less steady but more intentional than they used to be. When the door was finally hung on its hinges, he carved a new sign and bolted it to the entrance gate. Comet Haven, a sanctuary for the left behind. It wasn't grand, but it was true. Late one afternoon, as fog crawled up from the sea, a dusty brown sedan rolled onto the property. The engine sputtered twice before shutting off. The driver stepped out, a man in his mid-50s with a sunken face, sun-spotted skin, and a veteran's ball cap pulled low. He held himself like someone perpetually braced for bad news. He cleared his throat. "Sir, someone in town said you take in old dogs," he said quietly, "and maybe old folks who don't got much left. I've got a shepherd mix in the back seat, and well, not many places want us anymore." Ephraim studied the man, not with suspicion but recognition. He saw the exhaustion, the shame, the hope trying to bloom under all that weight. He smiled, fully, freely, without shadows this time. "You came to the right place," Ephraim said. "Bring him in, coffee's hot." And Briggs, standing beside him, wagged his tail once, as if giving the official welcome. In the quiet aftermath of storms, whether they come as wind and rain or as seasons of loss and loneliness, there are moments when the world reminds us that miracles do not always roar. Sometimes they whisper, sometimes they arrive on 4 tired legs. or in the steady breath of an old dog lying across a wounded man's chest, or in the simple courage to take one more step when no one believes you can. Ephraim, Briggs, and Comet survived because 3 fragile lives chose to hold on to one another. And perhaps that is one of God's gentlest truths. He often sends help not as lightning or thunder, but as companionship, as compassion, as the quiet warmth that rises when broken things decide they are not done yet. Maybe you've felt storms like these in your own life, days that drown your strength, nights when the past beats louder than the present, moments when you wonder if anyone sees you at all. If so, may this story remind you that even in the loneliest valleys, God still places small havens along the way, a kind voice, a loyal friend, a chance to begin again. And if you're hearing this now, may He bless you with the courage to keep going, the strength to heal, and the grace to recognize the miracles standing quietly beside you. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a little hope tonight. Leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, or how your own storm shaped you. And if you want more stories of faith, loyalty, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel. May God watch over you, your home, and every soul who finds refuge in small miracles.